They gave him one chance to speak, and in a land where words could save a life or bury it 6 feet under, that kind of silence meant something. No man could ignore. The wind rolled low across the canyon, carrying dust and the faint scent of sage brushing against worn leather and horse sweat, as 12 Apache warriors stood in a perfect circle, boots planted firm in the dirt, eyes steady, rifles resting, but never relaxed. At the center of that circle stood Ethan Cole, hands bound in rough rope wrists, marked by the long ride in the sun, his hat gone, his shadow stretched thin across the ground, like it was already trying to leave him behind. No one spoke, not yet. Even the horses tied at the edge of camp seemed to feel it, the weight of what was coming, their ears twitching, but their bodies still like carved wood. Chief Takota sat just beyond the circle, his posture straight, unmoving, the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm, but from control, the kind a man earns after watching too many others make the wrong choice at the wrong time. His eyes rested on Ethan, not with anger, not even with judgment, but with something colder, something that waited. The only thing that moved was the strip of torn fabric clenched in Ethan's hand, swaying faintly with the breeze, pale against the dust, a small piece of cloth that somehow carried more weight than any weapon in that circle. A murmur passed through the warriors, low and quiet, like distant thunder that hadn't decided yet if it would strike. One man stepped forward, just a half step, boots grinding into the dirt, his gaze fixed hard on Ethan, like he was trying to pull a confession out of him. Without words, the silence stretched long enough to feel like it might break something inside a man if he held it too tight. Then Takota rose, slow, deliberate, each movement measured, like time itself followed his lead. And when he spoke, his voice didn't rise, didn't need to. It carried clean across the circle, cutting through the wind like it belonged there. You speak once, that is all. No threat, no promise, just truth laid bare for any man to take or leave. The words hung there heavy and final as the sky above. Ethan lifted his head just enough to meet the chief's eyes, and for a moment the world narrowed down to nothing but that distance between them, 20 feet of dry ground and a choice that couldn't be undone. He could feel every eye on him, every breath waiting, every second tightening like a rope pulled too far. He could say it. He could tell them about the river, how the current had turned fast and violent after the storm, how the woman had been caught in it, how he had ridden in without thinking, how his hand had grabbed hold of her dress when there was nothing else to grab, how the fabric had torn under the force of the water, and how he had dragged her to the bank alive, breathing, shaking, but alive. It was all there waiting behind his teeth. One sentence, maybe two, and this would be over. But when he looked past the chief, he saw her, Ayana, standing just outside the circle, her hands clenched at her sides, her dark eyes fixed not on him, but on the ground between them. And then she moved, barely a motion, just the smallest shake of her head, something a stranger would miss, something a careless man would ignore, but not him. He held her gaze long enough to understand what she could not say out loud. Out here, truth had a cost, and it didn't always fall on the man who spoke it. The wind picked up again, brushing past them, lifting dust in thin spirals, as Takota's voice came once more, quieter now, but heavier. Speak. The circle seemed to close in just a fraction, not enough to see, but enough to feel. Ethan drew a slow breath, tasting the dry air, letting it settle in his chest like it might be the last one he took as a free man. His fingers loosened slightly around the torn fabric, then tightened again, not in fear, but in decision. And when the moment came, when every man there leaned just a little closer, waiting for the words that would decide everything, Ethan Cole did the one thing none of them expected. He said nothing. Silence did not break the moment, it settled it, only grew heavier, like heat pressing down from a cloudless sky, and every man in that circle felt it, whether he admitted it or not, because a man who refuses to speak when his life depends on it is not a simple thing to judge. Ethan Cole stood as he was rope tied around his wrists, dust clinging to his boots, the torn fabric still in his hand. But now it seemed different. Now it was no longer proof. It was a question none of them could yet answer. A warrior shifted his weight, the leather of his holster creaking soft but sharp in the stillness. Another glance toward Ayana, then quickly away, as if looking too long might force him to choose a side before he understood what side even meant. Chief Takota did not move for several long seconds, his eyes fixed on Ethan, searching not for words, but for something deeper, something that could not be spoken easily. Out here, a man's truth did not always come from his mouth. Sometimes it came from what he refused to say. The chief stepped forward, one slow pace, the dust barely stirring beneath his moccasins, and stopped just inside the circle, close enough now to see the lines on Ethan's face, the Dryness on his lips, the steady way he held himself, without defiance, without fear, just still like a man who had already accepted the weight of his choice. You understand what silence means, Dakota said, his voice low, carrying only as far as it needed to, and Ethan met his gaze again, giving the smallest nod, not surrender, not challenge, just acknowledgement that he knew exactly what stood before him, and still chose to stand there. The wind brushed past, again softer this time, carrying a faint memory of water from somewhere far beyond the canyon, and for a moment something shifted in Ethan's eyes, not regret, not fear, but memory, quick and quiet, like a flicker of light beneath the surface. He saw it again, the river rising fast, the sound of rushing current louder than thought. The moment he had reached out, without asking, without waiting, because there had been no time for rules, no time for distance, just the simple truth that someone was about to be lost. If no one moved, and he had moved, he had not asked her name, had not asked her tribe, had not thought about what it might cost him or her. He had only seen a life slipping away and answered it the only way he knew how. But here that moment looked different. Here it had shape and consequence, and a meaning he had not understood. When his hands had closed around the fabric and pulled hard enough to tear it, the circle tightened, not in distance, but in feeling, as if every man present leaned inward, without moving, drawn by something they could not yet name. One of the older warriors spoke, then his voice rough with years and quiet authority, saying something in Apache that carried a tone more than a meaning, something like doubt, something like caution. Takada listened without turning his head, then raised a hand, just enough to still any further words. The decision was his, and no one else would carry it for him. Ayana had not moved since Ethan's silence. She stood with her shoulders drawn tight, her breath shallow, her eyes now lifted, but not to the chief, not to the warriors, only to Ethan. And there was something there now, something that had not been there before. Not fear, not entirely. It was the look of someone who had expected to stand alone and suddenly was not sure if she did anymore. Takoda's gaze followed that line of sight from Ethan to Ayana and back again, and something in his expression shifted, not softening, not yet, but changing, like a door opening just enough to let a different thought step through. He reached out slowly, not for a weapon, but for the piece of torn fabric in Ethan's hand, and waited. Ethan hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then released it, letting the cloth pass between them. Light as it was, it seemed to carry the weight of everything that had not been said. Takada held it up, studying the edges, the way it had been torn, not cut, not clean, but rough, uneven, the mark of force and urgency, not intention. His thumb traced the frayed threads, then stopped, as if he had found what he was looking for, or perhaps what he had not expected to find. The chief lowered the cloth and looked at Ethan once more, long and steady. And in that silence, something began to change. Not in the circle, not yet, but in the space between two men who understood that sometimes the truth a man refuses to speak is the only truth that matters. The wind shifted again, but this time it carried something else, not just dust, not just the dry breath of the canyon, but a tension that had begun to turn into understanding, slow and reluctant, like a door that had been closed too long. Chief Takoda lowered his hand with the torn fabric still between his fingers, and for the first time the circle did not feel like a place of judgment. It felt like a place waiting for something to reveal itself. The older warrior who had spoken before stepped closer now, his eyes narrowing as he studied Ethan with a different kind of focus, not looking for guilt, but for contradiction, for any sign that the silence was a lie. But there was none. Ethan stood as he had from the beginning, steady, grounded, his breathing, even his shoulders, neither raised in defense nor lowered in surrender, just there, as if he belonged to the moment. Instead of resisting it, Takada turned slightly, holding the fabric up so the light caught the frayed edges and every man could see it clearly. The threads pulled apart, not sliced, not shaped by intent, but broken by force and speed. He spoke then, not loudly, but with enough weight that no one mistook the importance of it. This was not cut. The words settled into the air, like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that moved through every man standing there. The warriors exchanged glances, brief, but telling something had shifted, and they knew it even if they did not yet say it aloud. Ayana's breath caught, just barely audible, but enough to mark the change inside her. As well, her eyes moved from the cloth to Ethan and then to the chief, as if she were watching the truth rise without her needing to carry it alone. Takoda stepped forward again, closing the distance until he stood just a few feet from Ethan, close enough to see the fine dust on his skin, the faint marks on his wrists, the quiet in his eyes. You did not speak because you could not, or because you would not, Takoda asked in this time there was something different in his voice, not suspicion, not yet respect, but the edge of something that might become it. Ethan did not rush his answer. He did not break the stillness quickly like a man eager to escape it. He simply let the moment sit between them before he spoke his first word since entering the circle. "I could," he said, his voice low, steady, shaped by the same calm that had held him silent. "But I would not." The difference hung there, clear and undeniable. A man who could speak and chose not to was a man making a decision, not a man trapped by fear. Takota's gaze sharpened, not in anger, but in recognition, as if he had just been given a piece of something he had been waiting to see. The older warrior let out a slow breath, then nodded once, not to Ethan, but to the chief, acknowledging what was beginning to take shape. The circle did not tighten now. It loosened just slightly, enough that the air could move again, enough that the weight pressing down began to lift in small, unseen ways. Ayana took a step forward before she realized she had moved, her boots pressing softly into the dirt, her hands no longer clenched at her sides but open, uncertain, as if she were no longer sure where to place them. In a moment that had changed without warning, Takota noticed the movement without turning his head, his awareness catching everything without needing to show it. He held the cloth out once more, then let it fall from his hand, the fabric drifting down slowly until it touched the ground between them, a small thing returning to the earth, yet carrying the echo of everything that had passed through it. Silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence it had been before. It was not a wall. Now it was a space, one that allowed truth to exist without being forced into words. Takota looked from Ethan to Ayana and back again, and this time there was no doubt in his expression, only a question, not of what had happened, but of why a man would choose to stand alone when he did not have to. And in that question lay the beginning of something deeper than judgment, something that did not belong to law or tradition alone, but to the quiet place where a man decides who he is when no one else can decide it for him. The air did not move for a long moment after his words settled, and in that stillness, something unseen passed between the men standing there, something older than law and quieter than pride. Chief Takota did not answer right away. He let the silence hold its ground, as if testing whether Ethan Cole would shift under it, whether he would look away, or speak again, or reach for something to ease what he had already chosen. But Ethan did none of that. He simply stood, as before, steady and present, like a man who had already placed his weight on one side of a scale and would not touch it again. The chief stepped past the fallen cloth, his boots pressing lightly into the dust, and began to circle Ethan, not like a hunter, not like a judge, but like a man studying a story written without words. Every movement was slow, deliberate, his eyes tracing the lines of Ethan's posture, the way he held his shoulders, the way his hands rested, even while bound, the way his breathing did not quicken or falter under the weight of being watched. A lesser man would have filled that silence with explanation, with excuses, with anything that might tip the moment in his favor. But Ethan had chosen the harder road, the one that left him exposed to whatever came next, and Takota could see that clearly now. He stopped at Ethan's side, then moved behind him, completing the circle before returning to stand face to face once more. And when he spoke, his voice carried something new, not doubt, not accusation, but the edge of respect that had not yet fully formed. "You knew what would happen if you stayed silent," Takota said. And Ethan answered without hesitation, yes. The word was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he had accepted without asking for anything in return. The older warrior stepped forward again, his gaze now softer though no less sharp, and spoke in Apache to the chief, his tone measured, thoughtful, not pressing for punishment now, but for understanding. Takota listened, then raised his hand slightly in acknowledgement before turning his attention once more to Ethan and then to Ayana, who had not moved since stepping forward, her presence now impossible to ignore. The chief's eyes lingered on her for a moment, and something passed there, a question perhaps, or a realization that did not need to be spoken aloud. Ayana lifted her chin just enough to meet his gaze, and though her voice did not come, yet her silence was no longer the same silence it had been before. It was not fear now. It was something steadier, something that stood beside Ethan's choice instead of hiding behind it. The wind moved again, brushing across the camp, stirring the edge of the fallen cloth at their feet, as if reminding them all that small things could carry large truths if a man knew how to see them. Takota bent down slowly and picked it up once more, turning it in his hand, then holding it out toward Ayana. Without speaking, she hesitated only a moment before stepping closer, her fingers brushing the fabric carefully, as if it held more than memory, as if it held a moment, she had not yet fully faced. When she looked up again, her eyes met Ethan's, and there was no signal this time, no warning, no silent plea, only acknowledgement, plain and unguarded, that he had carried something for her that she had not been ready to carry herself. The chief watched that exchange without interrupting, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter but carried farther than before, because now every man there was listening, not for judgment, but for truth. A man who protects another with silence does not do it for nothing. Dakota said, his gaze fixed on Ethan, but his words meant for all of them. The circle shifted again, not breaking, but changing shape, as if the ground beneath them had moved just enough to make room for something new. Ethan did not answer because there was nothing left for him to say. He had already given all he intended to give, and now the moment belonged to someone else, whether she chose to take it or not. And for the first time since this began, the weight in the air did not feel like something pressing down. It felt like something waiting to rise. No one moved at first, not even the wind, as if the land itself was waiting to see who would carry the next piece of truth into the open. Iana still held the torn fabric between her fingers, her grip light but steady now, no longer afraid of what it meant, only aware of what it had already done. Her eyes remained on Ethan, not searching, not questioning, but seeing him fully for the first time, not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as a man who had stepped into something he did not understand and still chose to stand inside it without turning away. Chief Dakota watched her closely, not with pressure, but with patience, the kind that did not demand an answer, but made space for one to come. When it was ready around them, the circle of warriors held firm, but their stance had softened in ways that could not be measured in distance or posture. It was in their eyes now, in the way they no longer looked at Ethan as something to judge, but as something to understand. The older warrior lowered his gaze slightly, then looked back up at the chief, giving a small nod that carried more agreement than words ever could. Dakota turned back to Iana and spoke her name quietly, not as a command, but as an invitation. And it was enough. She drew in a slow breath, her chest rising with the effort of it, as if speaking now would cost more than silence ever had. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it did not need to be. It moved clean through the air, touching every ear. Without force, he pulled me from the water, she said, and the words did not tremble this time. They landed steady, grounded in truth. He did not know who I was. He did not ask. He only saw, and he acted. The wind shifted again, carrying her voice farther than it should have, reaching even those at the far edge of the camp who had not been part of the circle, but now stood still listening. She lifted the cloth slightly, then lowered it again, her eyes never leaving Ethan's face. When it tore, she continued, it was because I was already being taken by the current, not by him. A quiet ripple moved through the warriors, not of surprise, but of recognition, something that settled into place where doubt had once been. Dakota did not interrupt. He let her speak fully, let the truth come without shaping it or guiding it, because a truth offered freely carries more weight than one pulled from a man under pressure. Iana stepped one pace closer, now her voice gaining strength, not from volume, but from certainty. I told him to let go, she said, her gaze steady, her words clear. I told him it would be better if he did, but he did not listen. He held on. The last words lingered in the air longer than the rest, not because they were louder, but because of what they carried. A choice made in a moment where there had been no time to weigh anything except whether to act or not. Dakota's eyes shifted briefly to Ethan, then back to Iana, and something in his expression settled completely now. No longer searching, no longer testing, but knowing. The chief turned slightly, addressing the circle without raising his voice. The cloth speaks, he said simply, and in those words there was no room left for doubt. The older warrior exhaled slowly, then stepped back, his stance easing fully now, as if the ground beneath him had become steady again. One by one the others followed, not in movement, but in presence. The tension that had held them rigid releasing in small unseen ways. Ethan remained where he was, the rope still around his wrists, though it no longer seemed to define him. His silence no longer a question, but an answer already given. Iana lowered the cloth completely, now letting it rest at her side, her shoulders no longer drawn tight, her breath even as she stood beside the truth she had finally allowed into the open. Dakota stepped forward, once more closing the distance between himself and Ethan, and for a brief moment neither man spoke, because there was nothing left that needed to be said in words. The chief looked at the rope, then at Ethan's face, then back again, and in that quiet space between them the final piece of the moment began to take shape, not in judgment, not in forgiveness, but in recognition of something that did not belong to one side or the other, but to the space where both could stand without turning away. The rope came loose, without a sound, as Chief Dakota reached forward and cut it free with one clean motion, not hurried, not ceremonial, just precise like a man correcting something that should never have been tied in the first place. Ethan's hands fell to his sides, the mark still there, but no longer holding him, and for a moment he did not move, as if the absence of weight needed time to settle into something real. The circle did not break, but it opened in a way that could not be seen, only felt, the distance between each man widening just enough to let the air pass through again, to let the moment breathe. Ayanna exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering, as if she had been carrying something heavy for longer. Then she realized the torn fabric still in her hand, now nothing more than cloth. No longer a question, no longer a threat. Dakota stepped back half a pace, his eyes still on Ethan, but the edge of judgment gone, replaced by something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself. You understood our law without knowing it, he said quietly, and Ethan lifted his gaze, not in pride, not in relief, but in simple acknowledgement that some things do not need to be explained to be followed. I did not understand it, Ethan replied. I just knew she should not pay for what I did. The words were plain, but they settled deeper than anything spoken before, because they were not offered to defend him, they were offered because they were true. The older warrior let out a breath that almost sounded like a quiet laugh, not mocking, not amused, but something closer to respect that had taken its time arriving. Dakota glanced toward him briefly, then back to Ethan, and nodded once, not as a reward, but as recognition, earned in silence around them. The warriors shifted their stance, fully now no longer forming a barrier, but a presence. Something that held space rather than closed it. One man stepped back, another lowered his gaze. The tension that had once lived in their hands now gone without needing to be dismissed. Ayanna stepped closer until she stood just beside Ethan, not behind him, not apart from him, but beside him, where the truth had placed her. She held the cloth out to him, and for a moment he did not take it, as if unsure whether it still belonged to him. Then he reached forward, slowly, his fingers brushing hers only briefly, before the fabric passed between them, light as ever, but no longer carrying the same weight. He folded it once, then again, not as evidence, not as memory, but as something finished. Dakota watched the exchange in silence, then turned slightly, addressing the circle with a voice that did not need to rise. This matter is done, he said, and the words carried outward like a line drawn in the sand, clear and final. No one questioned it, no one needed to. The older warrior nodded once more, then turned away, stepping out of the circle. His place no longer required. The others followed, not in unison, not as a command, but as a natural end to something that had already resolved itself. One by one, they moved back toward their horses, their fires, their quiet conversations, the world returning to its rhythm, without force, without ceremony. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, his hands free, his posture unchanged, as if freedom was not something he needed to test. Ayanna looked at him, then toward the open stretch of land beyond the camp, where the canyon widened into distance. You can go now, she said, her voice softer than before, but no less certain. He nodded once, not because he was told, but because it was time. He adjusted his stance slightly, feeling the ground beneath his boots, as if confirming it was still there, then turned toward the edge of the camp. Dakota did not stop him, did not offer words, or warning, or invitation. He simply watched as Ethan began to walk away, each step steady, unhurried, the kind of pace that belongs to a man who has nothing left to prove. Halfway to the edge, Ethan paused, not turning fully, just enough that his voice could carry back across the space between them. You did not have to believe me, he said. Dakota answered without hesitation. I did not believe you, he said. I believed what you chose not to say. The wind carried the words farther than they needed to go, and for a moment, everything stilled again, not in tension, not in judgment, but in understanding. Ethan gave the smallest nod, then continued walking, the distance between him and the camp growing with each step, until he was just a figure against the wide open land, and behind him Ayanna remained where she stood, the fabric no longer in her hand, the weight no longer on her shoulders, watching not the man who left, but the space he had made by staying silent when it mattered most. The sound of his boots faded slowly into the open land, each step carried away by wind and distance, until Ethan Cole was no longer part of the circle, but not entirely gone either, because something he had done remained behind, woven into the silence he left in his wake. Ayanna did not follow him at first. She stood where she was, watching the line where earth met sky, as if trying to understand how a man could walk away from something like that without asking for anything in return. The camp had begun. To breathe again, fires crackled, low voices returned in quiet tones, horses shifted against their reins, but none of it touched the space she was standing in. It was still held by what had just passed. Chief Dakota remained near the center, his eyes not on Ethan anymore, but on the ground where the cloth had fallen earlier. As if tracing the path of something unseen, the older warrior returned to his side. After a moment, his steps slow, thoughtful. He chose silence over life, the man said quietly, not as a question, but as a fact. Dakota nodded once because there was nothing to argue in that truth. Some men choose words because they fear what silence might cost. Dakota replied, his voice low, steady. Others choose silence because they already know. Ayanna turned slightly at those words, her gaze shifting back toward the direction Ethan had gone, and something in her chest tightened, not with fear, not anymore, but with something she had not expected to feel, respect that carried weight because it had been earned without being asked for. She began to walk, then not fast, not urgent, just steady, following the path Ethan had taken, though the distance between them had already grown long enough that she could not yet see him. The ground stretched wide beneath her boots, dust rising soft with each step, the air warmer. Now, as the sun climbed higher overhead, she did not know what she would say if she caught up to him. She only knew that silence had already been given once, and she would not let it be the only thing left between them. Ahead, Ethan had not hurried. He walked the way a man walks when he is not running from anything and not chasing anything either, just moving forward, because that is what comes next. He heard her before he saw her, the soft rhythm of footsteps behind him, not hidden, not cautious, and he slowed slightly, not stopping, but allowing the distance to close without forcing it. When she reached him, she did not speak right away. She fell into step beside him, her presence quiet, but certain, like the truth she had finally carried into the open. For several long moments they walked that way, side by side, without words, the land stretching out in front of them, open and unclaimed. The kind of space where men and women make their own meaning if they are willing to stand in it. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but clear. You could have told them. Ethan kept his eyes forward, his tone even. I know. A pause, then softer. I chose not to. She looked at him, studying his face, not searching for doubt anymore, but trying to understand the shape of the man behind the choice. You did not know what it would cost you, she said. He shook his head slightly. I knew enough. That answer stayed with her longer than she expected, because it was not about certainty, it was about willingness, something deeper than knowing, something that could not be taught, only chosen. She looked ahead again, the horizon wide and endless, and then back at him. Why, she asked, not as a challenge, but as something real, something she needed to hear from him directly. Ethan let the question settle before answering, because it deserved more than a quick reply. Because you asked me not to, he said simply, and that was all there was. No weight added to it, no claim, no expectation, just the truth as he saw it. She stopped walking, then, her boots still in the dust, and he took one more step before noticing and turning back slightly to face her. The wind moved between them, carrying the quiet of the land with it. You trusted me, she said, not quite a question, not quite a statement. Ethan met her gaze, steady, calm. I trusted what I saw in you. That was enough to break whatever distance remained between them, not in space, but in understanding. Ayanna stepped forward again, closing that final gap, her voice softer now, but stronger than before. Then do not leave yet, she said, not as a demand, but as something closer to an offer. The land stretched wide around them, silent, patient, waiting to see what choice would come next. The wind slowed, as if the land itself was listening, and for a moment nothing moved between them, not the dust, not the air, not even the distance that had once stood like a wall between two worlds. Ethan did not answer her right away, not because he did not understand what she was asking, but because he understood it too well. To stay was not just to remain in one place, it was to step into something that had no clear path, no easy ending, only the quiet weight of what had already begun. He looked back toward the camp in the distance, the shapes of horses and men now small against the wide stretch of earth, then back to Ayanna, whose gaze had not wavered. She was not asking him to stay for herself alone, that much he could see. There was something larger behind her words, something tied to the space he had stood in, the circle, something that had shifted not just for them but for those who had watched in silence. I do not belong here, he said finally, his voice calm but firm, not as refusal, but as truth spoken without defense. Ayanna nodded slightly, as if she had expected that answer, because belonging was not something given easily in a land shaped by memory and boundary. No, she said quietly, you do not. But her eyes held his a moment longer, and then she added, neither do I, not in the way they expect. The words settled between them, not as conflict, but as something. Shared something that did not need explanation to be understood. Ethan studied her more closely, now seeing not just the strength she carried, but the space around it, the part of her that stood between two meanings. Just as he did, though, from a different path, the wind moved again, brushing through her hair, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth, and something else, something like change that could not be named, but could be felt. She turned slightly, looking out over the open land, then back at him. The chief will not say it, she continued, because it is not his way, but what you did will not be forgotten here. That is not always a good thing. Her voice held no warning, no fear, only honesty, the kind that leaves a man to decide for himself what weight he is willing to carry. Ethan let that settle, not rushing to answer, because the road ahead had never been about what was easy. He had lived long enough under open sky to know that a man does not always get to choose where he belongs, but he does choose what he stands for, and sometimes that is the only ground that matters. I did not stay for them, he said after a moment. I stayed for you. Iana's expression shifted, not into surprise, but into something quieter, something that had been there before, but not yet spoken. Then you should not leave for them either, she replied. The words were simple, but they carried a different kind of invitation, not one tied to tribe or place, but to something more personal, something that existed between two people who had seen each other at a moment where truth could not be hidden. The distance between them closed without either stepping forward, the space filled not by movement, but by understanding. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension that had followed him since the river, since the circle, since the silence, beginning to loosen, not disappearing, but settling into something he could carry without it pulling him apart. He glanced once more toward the horizon, then back to her. And in that moment the choice became clear, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. I will stay. While he said, not as a promise, but as a decision, made in the present and left open to what might come. Iana nodded, once not smiling, not celebrating, just accepting it as it was, because some choices do not need to be marked by anything more than being made. Behind them, the camp waited, quiet and unchanged on the surface, yet something within it had already begun to shift. The chief stood where he had been, watching from a distance, not interfering, not calling them back, only observing, as a man who understood that some decisions do not belong to leaders or to laws, but to the people who must live with them. The sun moved higher, casting longer light across the land, stretching shadows in new directions, and as Ethan turned with Iana to walk back toward the camp, the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was steady, the kind that does not hide truth, but holds it without needing to speak. And somewhere behind them, the path he had walked alone began to fade into the dust, leaving no trace except in the choices that would follow. The camp did not greet them when they returned, not with voices, not with questions, not with anything that would disturb what had already been settled. The kind of quiet that follows truth is different from the kind that hides it, and every man there seemed to understand the difference without needing it explained. Ethan walked beside Iana at an even pace, neither ahead nor behind, and as they crossed back into the circle that had once held him, the space opened naturally, without command, without resistance, a path forming where before there had been none. Chief Dakota remained where he had stood, his posture unchanged, his presence as steady as the land itself, and when Ethan stopped a few feet away, the two men faced each other once more, but this time there was no weight pressing between them, only a silence that did not ask anything more. Dakota studied him for a long moment, not searching, not testing, simply seeing, and then he gave a small nod, not of approval, not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement, the kind given to a man who has already answered for himself. You chose to return, the chief said, his voice calm, measured. Ethan answered just as simply, I said I would stay a while. The words did not carry promise, they carried presence, and that was enough. Dakota turned his gaze briefly to Iana, then back to Ethan, and in that movement something settled fully into place. Then you will be seen for what you are, he said, not as a warning, but as a truth that comes with being known. The older warrior stood nearby, watching quietly, his arms relaxed, now his stance no longer guarded. He nodded once toward Ethan, as if recognizing something that had taken time to reveal itself around them. The rest of the camp had resumed its rhythm. Fires were tended, horses watered, quiet conversations carried on, but every so often a glance would pass in Ethan's direction, not curious, not hostile, simply aware, the kind of awareness that comes when a story has already reached its ending and left something behind. Ethan did not try to explain himself, he did not speak more than needed, he simply moved through the space with the same calm he had carried into it earlier that day, and slowly, without force, Without demand, the space began to accept him, not fully, not yet, but enough. Ayana walked a few steps ahead, then paused near a low fire pit, where the coals still held warmth. She looked back at him, and for a moment, neither spoke because there was nothing left that needed shaping with words. He stepped closer and stood beside her, the heat from the coals rising faint against the cool shift of afternoon air, and for a while they remained there, watching the small movements of the camp, the quiet life that continued without interruption. Then Ayana reached down and placed the folded cloth into the edge of the fire, not thrown, not discarded, just placed where it could return to something else. The fabric caught, slowly, the edges curling inward, the threads loosening and turning to ash without resistance, and neither of them looked away as it disappeared, because some things are not meant to be carried beyond their moment. When it was gone, Ayana brushed her hands together lightly, then looked out toward the horizon again. The land does not forget, she said quietly, not as a warning, not as a burden, but as something that simply is. Ethan followed her gaze, the wide stretch of earth, endless and open, the kind of place where a man could disappear or be remembered depending on what he left behind. I did not come here to be remembered, he said. Ayana nodded. Once I know. She glanced at him, then back to the land. But you will be. The wind moved through the camp again, softer, now carrying with it the sounds of horses, shifting low voices, the crackle of fire, and something else, something quieter, something that settles after a moment has passed and leaves its shape behind. The sun dipped lower, stretching shadows long across the ground, changing the way everything looked without changing what it was. Ethan stood there beside her, not as a stranger, not as one of them, but as something in between, and for the first time that space did not feel like a place without belonging. It felt like a place chosen out here. A man does not always earn his place with words. Sometimes he earns it by knowing when not to use them. And as the light faded and the day gave way to evening, the silence that had once stood against him now stood with him, steady and unbroken, a part of the land, just like everything else that endures without needing to be spoken.